The autumn air felt crisp as the car slowly rolled up the long, winding driveway. Surrounded by towering trees shedding their golden leaves, the house appeared in the distance like something from an old storybook. Its stone exterior and tall, narrow windows hinted at a time long past. A large iron gate creaked slightly as the car passed through, and the gravel crunched under the tires, adding to the eerie stillness of the moment. It was the kind of house that could give anyone a sense of foreboding, yet for Sarah and her husband James, it was a fresh start. "Home sweet home," Sarah whispered under her breath, though her voice carried a trace of uncertainty. She wasn't entirely sure if she could truly call it home yet. The house had been left to them by her aunt, a woman she had barely known, who passed away suddenly. Sarah had never visited this house growing up, and now, with James, she had returned to fulfill the obligation of dealing with the inheritance. It wasn't exactly the kind of place she would have chosen for herself, but it was a chance for a new beginning. James, however, was excited. He was the practical one, always looking for opportunities to turn something old into something useful. "We can fix it up, make it ours," he said, unloading the boxes from the back of their car. He wasn't fazed by the house's age or the lingering sense of mystery in the air. To him, it was just a fixer-upper. Nothing more. The house was massive, with 3 floors, an attic, and a basement, all of it cloaked in shadows. As they stepped inside, the smell of dust and old wood filled the air, and a chill seemed to settle over them immediately. The heavy front door closed with a deep, final thud behind them. "Wow, it's big," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the empty hallway. The floors creaked beneath their feet as they moved further into the house. The decor was antique, almost frozen in time. Velvet curtains, faded portraits of long-dead relatives, and wooden furniture covered in sheets. It looked like no one had lived here for years. The house, while undeniably beautiful, felt cold, colder than it should have been, even though the weather was still mild outside. The strange silence was almost suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They started unpacking the car, and as Sarah began sorting through boxes, James went upstairs to check out the bedrooms. Their new bedroom was large, with a massive 4-poster bed that seemed to dominate the space. It was adorned with delicate lace curtains, but what caught Sarah's attention was a small, dusty chair sitting in the far corner of the room. A porcelain doll sat upon it, its wide eyes staring blankly ahead and its hands folded neatly in its lap. "James, what's this?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with unease. She took a hesitant step toward the doll, its lifelike features almost too perfect. She couldn't help but feel a shiver run down her spine as she noticed the doll's long, dark hair, carefully combed and neatly tied with a red ribbon. The soft porcelain of its face seemed to have a glossy sheen, and its eyes, though glassy, seemed to follow Sarah's movements. James, hearing her voice, came into the room. "Oh, that's the doll. I think it belonged to Aunt Margaret. It was probably something she collected over the years," he explained nonchalantly, brushing past Sarah to put down his box. "Looks like it's been here a while, doesn't it?" He gave the doll a quick glance and then turned away, continuing his unpacking. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the doll. Its presence was unsettling, as if it didn't belong there, as if it were watching her. She shuddered, trying to dismiss the thought as nothing more than the anxiety of moving into a new place. Still, she couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward it. "I'll just leave it there for now," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly as she stepped away. She forced a smile, trying to push away the sense of discomfort that had crept up her spine. "I'll unpack the rest of the boxes." Later, as the sun began to set and shadows stretched long across the rooms, Sarah and James sat in the living room, eating takeout pizza. The house, despite the quietness, was starting to feel like it could be their home. Yet, Sarah couldn't stop glancing up at the dark hallway leading to the upstairs. That feeling, that something wasn't quite right, refused to leave her. Before they retired for the night, Sarah checked the doll again. She half expected it to have moved, but it was still sitting in the same spot, unmoving. As Sarah pulled the covers up to her chin in the guest room, she tried to reassure herself. It was just an old doll. Nothing more. The wind howled softly outside, the house groaned as if settling into the night, and both Sarah and James eventually drifted off to sleep. But neither of them could have known that what they had just inherited was far more than an old house, and the doll, it seemed, was not as harmless as it first appeared. The days in the old house passed slowly, and Sarah tried to focus on the excitement of settling in. They unpacked more boxes, rearranged furniture, and even began painting some of the walls. Still, a sense of unease lingered, especially as the doll remained in its corner. Despite Sarah's attempts to ignore it, she couldn't shake the growing discomfort she felt every time she saw it. At night, it seemed to be watching them with those unblinking eyes, and during the day, the air in the room would feel heavier, almost suffocating. James, ever the skeptic, dismissed her concerns. "It's just an old doll, Sarah. Nothing more. I'm sure Aunt Margaret had it for years. These things are just relics of the past." But even James, who had always been so practical, started to feel a bit uneasy. The house, despite its beauty, felt wrong. Strange things began happening, things they couldn't quite explain. The creaking sounds in the attic grew louder at night, sometimes keeping them awake. The faint smell of something floral, almost like perfume, seemed to drift through the halls, despite no one wearing it. It was subtle, but it was there. One afternoon, when James was out running errands, Sarah decided to explore the house further. She had tried to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right, but it was becoming impossible to dismiss. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she ventured into the attic. The attic was dark, with only a small window allowing faint light to filter through the dusty air. It was filled with boxes, old furniture, and trunks covered in cobwebs. But something caught her eye. A small, leather-bound book sitting on an old wooden desk. It seemed to call to her, though she wasn't sure why. With trembling hands, Sarah picked it up. The cover was faded, the leather cracked with age, and the pages inside were yellowed with time. She opened it slowly, the musty smell of old paper filling her nose. The first few pages were filled with notes about the house. A journal of sorts, written by her late Aunt Margaret. The writing was neat, but the words had an unsettling tone. As Sarah read through the journal, she discovered that Aunt Margaret had always been fascinated with the supernatural. She'd dabbled in spiritualism, and over the years, she'd become obsessed with the idea of contacting spirits. The journal detailed Margaret's belief that the house itself was haunted by the restless spirit of a little girl who had died there decades earlier. The girl, who had been named Lily, had owned the porcelain doll, and it was said to be the object that kept her spirit bound to the house. The journal explained that Lily had tragically died at a young age under mysterious circumstances in the very room where Sarah and James now slept. Margaret had come to believe that the doll was a conduit for Lily's spirit, and she had performed a ritual to try and keep the spirit contained. But the ritual had been incomplete, leaving the spirit and the doll with lingering power. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she read further. The journal described strange occurrences in the house that Margaret had documented: doors opening on their own, strange whispers in the night, and objects moving without explanation. But most chilling of all was a final note written hastily on the last page: "I fear I have not succeeded in binding her spirit. The doll is not just a vessel. It is a doorway. And I believe that soon she will come back to claim what is hers." Sarah slammed the journal shut, her heart racing. She couldn't believe what she had just read. It was absurd, right? Spirits, rituals, curses? It all sounded like something out of a horror movie. But the more she thought about it, the more everything seemed to fit. The doll, the strange occurrences, the feeling of being watched, it all started to make sense. That night, Sarah couldn't bring herself to sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the doll. It was impossible to ignore what the journal had said, especially after everything that had happened so far. She tried to tell herself it was all just coincidence, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. As she lay there, straining to hear any sound that might indicate something was wrong, she thought she heard something. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, the soft creak of the rocking chair in the corner of the room. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, she turned her head toward the corner. The doll sat there, just as it had when they had moved in. But something was different now. The chair was rocking gently, as if someone or something had been sitting there. Sarah couldn't take it any longer. She shot out of bed and rushed to the corner, but the doll was still. The chair had stopped moving. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing. It was just her imagination, she told herself. It had to be. But as she backed away from the corner, her foot hit something on the floor, and she looked down. The journal, the one she had left in the attic, was sitting there on the floor. How had it gotten there? Her heart raced in her chest as the realization hit her. The doll wasn't just moving on its own. It was trying to communicate. It was trying to tell her something. And she was running out of time. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The house, which she had tried to call home, felt more like a prison now. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows grew longer, and the silence was almost deafening. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside seemed to bring her closer to the realization that she and James were not alone in this house. It wasn't just the doll that haunted the space, it was something far more sinister. James, however, remained calm and dismissive. "You're just stressed from moving. It's an old house, Sarah. Old houses make noises. Nothing more." He kissed her on the forehead as if to reassure her before heading to bed himself. But as Sarah lay in their new bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep eluded her. She was acutely aware of every sound in the house, the ticking of an old clock, the wind howling outside, the soft rustle of leaves scraping against the window. Yet, amidst all of these sounds, there was something else, something faint, almost imperceptible. A soft tapping, like the sound of fingers on wood just outside the door. Her heart raced as she listened. The sound continued, each tap a little louder, a little more persistent. "It's just the wind," she told herself. "It's just the house settling." But then the door creaked open. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She lay perfectly still, staring into the darkness, hoping that her mind was playing tricks on her. But the door was definitely ajar. She heard no footsteps, just the soft scrape of the door as it opened a little wider. She glanced over at James, but he was fast asleep, his breathing steady and deep. The tapping sound had stopped, but the door was still open. Feeling a surge of courage, Sarah got out of bed. She tiptoed toward the door, each step heavy with the dread that something was waiting just beyond it. But as she reached out to close the door, something caught her eye. It was the doll. The doll sitting on the rocking chair in the corner of the room. It wasn't where she had left it. It was no longer seated calmly, its porcelain face staring ahead. Instead, it was facing the bed, the eyes locked onto her. The rocking chair was gently swaying, as though someone had just left it. "It's nothing," Sarah thought, feeling her pulse race in her chest. "Just a trick of the light." She closed the door as quietly as she could, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. When she turned back to the bed, she caught sight of the clock on the nightstand. The hands read 3:14 a.m. The room felt colder now, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather outside. It felt like something or someone had entered the room with her. Her heart pounded as she slid back under the covers, pulling them tightly over her head as if that would protect her from whatever was out there. But as she lay there, her mind racing with thoughts of the doll, she heard the faintest sound, a whisper. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone murmuring just out of reach. Sarah's body tensed. She held her breath, straining to hear. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't English, though. It sounded like a child's voice, but the language was foreign, almost like a chant. Sarah didn't recognize the words, but they felt wrong, like they were meant to call something from deep within the house, from beyond the walls. Her mind flashed back to the journal she had found earlier in the attic. The warning Margaret had written, "The doll is a doorway." Sarah's instincts screamed at her to get up and leave, to run from the house, but her body refused to obey. She lay frozen, eyes wide open, her entire body rigid with fear. And then the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, more oppressive than the noise had ever been. It seemed as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The rest of the night passed in restless terror. Sarah couldn't sleep a wink, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the doll's face, its eyes staring back at her. Eventually, the first rays of dawn peeked through the curtains, and the heavy silence of the night seemed to lift. But Sarah didn't feel any better. The house had gotten under her skin, and now it was impossible to pretend it was just a place to live. When James finally woke up, Sarah was already out of bed, pacing the living room. She couldn't stay in that room any longer, couldn't bear to be near the doll. She looked at him with wide eyes, her face pale. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, James," she confessed, her voice trembling. "There's something wrong with this house. With that doll? I don't feel safe here." James rubbed his eyes, still groggy from sleep. "Sarah, you need to relax. It's an old house and you're just adjusting. You're letting your imagination run wild. Let's go out today, get some fresh air. We'll come back tonight and everything will be fine." But as Sarah looked at him, she could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe her. Maybe he wasn't ready to believe her. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. And it was only just beginning. As the days passed, the strange occurrences in the house became more frequent, more intense. Sarah tried to push the unsettling feeling aside, trying to believe that it was just the stress of moving, the tension of being in an unfamiliar place. But deep down, she knew that something was happening, something she couldn't explain. At first, it was small things. The sound of soft whispers in the hallway late at night, barely audible but unmistakable. Sometimes Sarah would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, to hear faint laughter like that of a child coming from the hallway or upstairs. When she got up to check, the house was silent as though nothing had happened. But the unease remained, lingering like a thick fog around her. One afternoon, Sarah was cleaning the kitchen when she noticed something that made her stomach churn. The knife block on the counter had shifted. She knew it had been placed neatly against the wall earlier, but now it was slightly askew, one knife pulled halfway out of its slot. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at it, trying to rationalize the situation. Could it have fallen out? Could she have accidentally moved it when unpacking? She didn't think so. She hadn't touched it, not since they'd arrived. She reached out and carefully slid the knife back into place. Just as her fingers touched the blade, a loud bang echoed from upstairs. It was so sudden, so violent, that it startled her. She dropped the knife, her heart racing as she rushed up the stairs, calling for James. "James?" she shouted. But there was no answer. The upstairs was eerily quiet. When Sarah reached the top of the stairs, she was confronted with a scene that made her blood run cold. The bedroom door to their room was wide open, and inside, the rocking chair was swaying gently back and forth. The doll was sitting in the chair, its porcelain face staring out toward the door. But that wasn't what terrified her. It was the fact that the doll was no longer facing forward, it was facing the door, its glassy eyes locked onto her. Frozen in place, Sarah's mind raced. This was impossible. She had left it in the corner, facing away from the door. Had James moved it? She couldn't bring herself to believe that. She turned quickly and descended the stairs to find him. When she found him in the living room, sitting on the couch reading a book, she could barely speak. Her voice trembled as she said, "The doll, it moved again. It's in the rocking chair, facing the door this time." James looked up from his book, his face a mixture of concern and irritation. "Sarah, I told you there's nothing wrong with that doll. It's just an old piece of junk. Maybe you moved it yourself without realizing." "I swear I didn't move it," she exclaimed. "James, this isn't just in my head. I've seen it. I've heard things. I felt things in this house. It's not just an old doll. I know something is wrong, and I don't know how much more of this I can take." James set the book down and stood up, placing his hands on her shoulders, looking at her with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Look, Sarah, I'm worried about you. You're under a lot of stress right now. This house is old, and I know it's a lot to adjust to, but you're letting your imagination run wild. It's just the creaks and groans of an old building. Nothing more." Sarah's eyes welled with tears, her frustration spilling out. "But it's not just creaks. It's happening. I don't feel safe here anymore. I think we need to leave." James didn't respond immediately, and Sarah felt a pang of loneliness. He didn't understand. She felt like she was losing her grip on reality, like the house was slowly driving her mad. She went to bed early that night, but sleep didn't come. The room felt colder than usual, and she lay wide awake, her thoughts racing. She kept glancing over at the corner of the room, where the doll had been sitting. But tonight it wasn't there. She got up, her heart pounding. The rocking chair was empty. There was no sign of the doll at all. It was then that she heard the soft whispering again, just like the night before. But this time it was different. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice, low and drawn out, almost like a chant. "Come closer." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She tried to convince herself it was just her mind playing tricks, but she couldn't deny the chill that had settled over the room. The voice was real, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the rocking chair. Slowly, hesitantly, Sarah turned her gaze toward the corner. The doll was back in the chair, but this time it was no longer sitting still. It was rocking back and forth slowly, as though it had a life of its own. Its glassy eyes gleamed in the darkness, and its mouth, which had always been painted shut, was now slightly open, just enough to see the hint of teeth. She backed away, stumbling over her feet as she tried to get to the door, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Come closer. Come closer, Sarah." Terror flooded her veins as she rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew it wasn't just the house. The doll, whatever it was real, and it was watching her. That night, Sarah barely slept. She kept hearing the whispering, and though she tried to block it out, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just behind her, waiting. When morning came, she rushed downstairs to find James, but he was nowhere to be found. His car was gone, and the house felt emptier than ever. She was alone now, and the house was closing in on her. Sarah had never felt more alone. The house, which once seemed like a blank canvas waiting to be filled, now felt like a cold, dark prison. The walls seemed to close in on her, and every corner held a secret, a presence that she couldn't escape. The doll, ever present, seemed to be the center of it all. Every time she turned around, it was there, staring at her with those lifeless eyes. But that morning, as Sarah wandered through the empty rooms, something in her snapped. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. She couldn't ignore the growing dread that gripped her every time she entered a room. The whispers, the movements, they were real. The doll wasn't just a decoration, it was a conduit, a doorway, as Margaret's journal had said. And the spirit, Lily, was real too. Sarah couldn't wait for James any longer. She needed answers. And she needed them now. Determined to understand what was happening in her home, Sarah went back to the attic where she had found Margaret's journal. She felt a strange pull toward it, as if the house itself was guiding her toward the answers she desperately needed. The attic was even darker than before, the dust thick in the air. She climbed the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest, and approached the small wooden desk where the journal had been. She opened the desk drawer, pulling out the journal once more. But this time it was different. The pages weren't as she had left them. There were new entries, recent entries written in a hurried, frantic hand. I can feel her presence now. She is growing stronger. The doll is the key. She is awakening, and I fear I have already gone too far. I must stop her before it's too late. But the doll is not just an object. It is a gateway, a portal to another world, and Lily. Lily is not just a spirit. She is something else, something more. Sarah's hands shook as she read. She knew what she had to do. She had to destroy the doll. She had to break the connection between Lily and the house. But could she do it? Could she sever the tie without losing herself in the process? The words in the journal spoke of a ritual, a way to contain the spirit and seal the portal forever. But it wasn't easy. The ritual would require both physical and spiritual strength. She would need to face Lily to confront the doll, the spirit, and destroy it. Sarah's mind was reeling with fear and determination. She couldn't do it alone. But James was still missing, and she couldn't afford to wait for him. She had to act now. With the journal in hand, Sarah made her way back down to the living room where she had left the doll. The air felt thicker now, charged with an unseen energy. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As she entered the room, her eyes locked onto the rocking chair. The doll was sitting there, just as it always had, but this time it was different. The rocking chair was moving on its own, slowly back and forth, and the doll was rocking with it. Its head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging her presence. Sarah's heart raced. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The time had come. She placed the journal on the coffee table and walked toward the doll. Every step felt like it was leading her into the depths of the unknown. The closer she got, the more intense the energy in the room became. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. Come closer, Sarah." The voice, no longer a whisper, now called out to her, pulling at her very soul. The doll's eyes seemed to gleam with malice, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. Sarah reached out, trembling, and grabbed the doll by the neck. The instant her fingers touched it, a wave of icy cold shot through her body, and she gasped, almost losing her balance. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. The temperature plummeted, and the walls seemed to close in around her. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching toward her. The whispers were now joined by a low, guttural voice, one that seemed to come from deep within the house. "You cannot escape me, Sarah. I will never let you go." Her heart hammered in her chest as she clutched the doll tighter, her fingers numb from the cold. She had to act quickly. The ritual, the only way to break the bond, was outlined in the journal, but she couldn't remember all the details. She had to trust her instincts. With a fierce determination, Sarah began chanting the words she had seen in the journal. They were ancient, foreign words that filled her with an overwhelming sense of power. As she spoke, the doll began to twitch in her hands. Its head jerked to the side, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The room shook, the walls groaning as if the house itself was alive, struggling against her. The whispers turned to screams, high-pitched and agonizing, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. But Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't. "I am the one in control," she whispered through clenched teeth. I will break this curse. You will not have me. With one final, powerful word, Sarah thrust the doll toward the ground with all her might. The room erupted in a blinding light, and for a moment, Sarah felt weightless, as if she were being pulled into another world. The air crackled with energy, and she was sure she could hear Lily's scream as the portal slammed shut. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The light dimmed, and the temperature in the room returned to normal. The oppressive presence that had filled the house seemed to lift, and the walls, once heavy with fear, now felt empty and hollow. The whispers were gone. The rocking chair was still. Sarah, her body trembling from the ordeal, looked down at the doll. It was lying on the floor, motionless. Its once lifeless eyes were now empty, like a soulless shell. She had done it. She had confronted Lily, faced the darkness, and won. But as she stood there, the weight of what she had just done began to sink in. She had destroyed the doll, destroyed the doorway, but at what cost? She looked around the room, now eerily silent, and knew that the house was no longer just a house. It was a place where something ancient, something dark, had once lived. And now it was gone. For good. The house felt different, but not in a comforting way. There was no longer the oppressive weight of unseen eyes watching her every move, no more whispers or chilling voices calling from the corners of rooms. Yet in the silence, Sarah felt an unfamiliar emptiness. The battle for her sanity, her very soul, was over, but at what cost? She hadn't seen James since the night she confronted the doll. After the ritual, when the house had gone still and the energy seemed to dissipate, Sarah had gone downstairs to find him, to tell him it was over, to show him that the nightmare was done. But when she entered the living room, she found no sign of him. His car was still gone, and Sarah assumed he must have gone out to clear his head, or perhaps he had been scared away by the strange events. But as the hours passed, doubt crept in. She tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The unease in her chest grew into a deep, gnawing fear. Had the doll, had Lily's spirit, done something to him? Was he lost in the house, trapped somewhere, or worse, taken by whatever had inhabited the doll? Panic set in as Sarah's thoughts spiraled. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, especially after everything they had been through. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the house, despite her victory, still had its claws in them. Determined to find James, she scoured the house. She called out for him, her voice trembling, but there was no answer. Each room seemed emptier than the last, like a shell, as though something vital had been removed. It was in the kitchen when she first noticed it, the lingering scent of something familiar, something she hadn't smelled in days. It was faint, but the same scent that had filled the air when Lily's presence was most intense. It was coming from the attic. Her heart skipped a beat as her legs carried her toward the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. She hadn't been in the attic since that night, when she had discovered Margaret's journal. The attic had always felt like a place of forbidden knowledge, a space holding too many secrets, and now it felt even more oppressive. Sarah hesitated at the base of the stairs. She could hear the faintest sound coming from above. It wasn't a whisper or a voice this time. It was a slow, rhythmic sound, like something shuffling, moving in the dark. Her pulse quickened, but she steeled herself, telling herself that she had to face whatever was left of this nightmare. She climbed the stairs and opened the attic door. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of aged wood and forgotten things hit her like a wave. The dim light from a small window offered little visibility, but she could make out a figure in the corner of the room. It was James. He was standing motionless, his back to her, facing the corner of the attic. His body was rigid, his hands hanging at his sides. His clothes were disheveled as though he had been in the attic for hours, maybe even days. "James?" Sarah's voice cracked as she called out to him. He didn't respond. "James, it's me. Are you okay?" she asked, her fear rising as she slowly approached him. When she was just a few steps away, she noticed something strange. His head was slightly tilted, just as the doll's had been, and his eyes were wide open, but they were empty. There was no recognition in them, just a vacant stare. His face, usually so full of warmth, was pale, as though drained of life. "James?" Sarah cried, reaching out for him. But as her hand brushed his shoulder, he jerked violently. His body stiffened, and for a moment it seemed like he was about to speak, but then he opened his mouth, and the sound that escaped was not his voice. "You cannot leave me, Sarah." The voice was low, distorted, almost like a growl, but it wasn't James's voice. It was the voice of something else, something ancient, something that had been trapped in the house. Her heart raced as she took a step back. "James, what's happening? Please say something." But there was no response. His head slowly turned toward her, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. His eyes were no longer the warm, brown eyes she had known. They were empty, hollow, like the doll's eyes, and she could see something moving in them. A shadow, flickering, alive. Her blood ran cold as she realized what had happened. The spirit of Lily, the entity that had inhabited the doll, had taken James. He was no longer himself. He was just another vessel for the evil that had been unleashed in the house. Panic surged within Sarah. She had thought that by destroying the doll she had sealed the portal, but it was clear that the house still held power over them. She had broken the connection, but something had been left behind. The doll, the spirit, they had latched onto James, using him as a host, and now they were feeding off of him, keeping him in the attic, in a state between life and death. The realization hit her like a wave. She couldn't save him like this. Not in this form. Not when he was already lost. But there was something she could do. She had one last option, one final ritual that could break the bond completely, one that would destroy the spirit and free James, but it came with a price. To save him, she would have to risk everything. The ritual required sacrifice not of life, but of something far more precious. As Sarah took a deep breath, preparing herself for what was to come, the shuffling sound from behind James grew louder, and she realized it wasn't just his movement she was hearing. There was something else, something in the shadows, closing in. The house was not done with her yet. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes locked on James, or what had once been James. The man she had loved, the man who had been by her side through everything, was no longer himself. The hollow emptiness in his eyes, the stiff, unblinking way he moved, it was all wrong. She had to do something, but she wasn't sure if it was even possible. How could she save him? How could she destroy something that had already taken root in him? The attic felt colder now, as though the very air had thickened with the presence of something ancient, something dark. The shadows that had once seemed like simple shapes now seemed to crawl and stretch toward her. She could feel them, could almost hear them whispering, urging her forward. "Come closer, Sarah." The voice came again, low and distorted, but this time it didn't come from James. It was the voice of the entity, of the spirit that had been tied to the doll. It sounded almost amused. "You think you can destroy me? You think you can save him? You're too late, Sarah. He is already mine." The words sent a shiver of dread down her spine, but she shook it off. She couldn't let fear control her now. She had to save James. He had to be saved. But how? Sarah remembered the ritual from the journal. The ritual that Margaret had outlined was the only way to sever the connection, to free James from whatever had taken him. But the cost was high. The journal had warned her. To truly destroy the spirit, to seal the portal, someone or something had to be sacrificed. The portal could only be closed with an exchange of power, with the willing surrender of a soul. But who? Who could she sacrifice to save James? Sarah's mind raced. There had to be another way. She refused to believe that she had to give up someone she loved to save him. There had to be a way to beat this thing, to break the cycle. She had already destroyed the doll. Wasn't that enough? Why wasn't it over? As the shadows in the room grew darker, as the whispers grew louder, Sarah felt a surge of desperation. She couldn't let this be the end. She couldn't lose James to the house, to Lily's spirit. He was everything to her, and she couldn't bear to think of living without him. The ritual in the journal, the one Margaret had written about, was her last hope. But she knew deep down that there was no escaping the price of that power. The journal had been clear, the spirit would not be banished without a sacrifice. Suddenly a thought struck Sarah like a lightning bolt. The sacrifice didn't have to be someone else. Maybe, just maybe, she could offer herself. It was the only way to guarantee James's freedom. She would give herself to the spirit, offer herself as the sacrifice in place of James. She had come so far, fought so hard to protect him. If she had to give up everything to save him, so be it. She loved him too much to let him suffer in this cursed house. But would it even work? Would the spirit accept such an offer? Or was it already too late? Her heart pounded in her chest as she faced the horrible truth. It might be too late for either of them. The house, the spirit, it was too powerful, too deep. But she couldn't just give up. Not without trying. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not going to leave you." His head tilted slightly in her direction, the movement slow, deliberate. His empty eyes were fixed on her as though he were listening. She could see the flicker of recognition in his gaze, but it was fleeting, like a dying ember. He wasn't truly gone. He couldn't be. She reached out, placing her hand on his, her fingers trembling. "I will save you," she whispered. "I promise." With no time left to waste, Sarah took a deep breath and began to chant the words from the journal once more. The words echoed through the attic, vibrating in the air like an ancient hymn. The power that had been dormant in the house began to stir. The shadows writhed in response, and the temperature dropped even further, until she could see her breath. She felt it then, the pull, the energy. The spirit was awakening, responding to her call. "I offer myself," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking but resolute. "I offer myself to you, Lily." "Release him. Release James." For a long moment, nothing happened. The air was thick with tension, and Sarah could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her. Her heart beat in her ears, and she held her breath, waiting for the spirit's response. Then suddenly there was a sharp, piercing scream. It wasn't just James. It was the house itself, the very walls groaning with agony. The shadows began to twist violently, and the room shook as though it were alive. James's body jerked violently, his head thrown back, and his mouth opened in a silent scream. Sarah fell to her knees, her hands still gripping his. The darkness around them swirled in a chaotic, furious dance, pulling at her, pulling at him. It felt like the entire house was alive, and it was fighting back. "You cannot have him, Lily," Sarah cried, her voice rising above the cacophony. "I am the one who decides. I am the one who will end this." In that moment, Sarah felt a surge of power, something that hadn't been there before. She wasn't just fighting the spirit. She was fighting for her life, for James's life, and for the future they should have had. The shadows screamed one last time before dissipating, leaving the attic in eerie silence. The temperature began to return to normal, and the oppressive energy that had once filled the house began to lift. Sarah opened her eyes to find James staring at her, his eyes no longer hollow but full of life, full of recognition. He was back. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice shaky as though he was waking from a deep sleep. "What happened?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she hugged him tightly. It was over. The spirit, the house, everything had finally been broken. The curse was lifted. But even as she held him, she knew that the house was forever changed. She had lost so much in the process. She had sacrificed herself, in a way, and given everything to save James. Now all she wanted was to leave. The house, though freed from the evil that had haunted it, still carried the echoes of everything that had happened. It was no longer their home. The journey was over, and Sarah and James would rebuild their lives. But they would never forget the house, the doll, or the darkness that had once nearly destroyed them. The sun was setting as Sarah and James stepped out of the house, their feet crunching on the gravel driveway that had once seemed like an obstacle to their happiness. Now it felt like freedom. The air was crisp, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, a beautiful contrast to the chaos they had left behind. They had spent the past few days packing up their things, cleaning out the house, and preparing to leave for good. The house that had once seemed like the place where they would build their future together had become a haunting reminder of everything they had survived. They didn't look back. As Sarah shut the door behind her, she could feel the last of the house's oppressive weight lifting off her shoulders. The house was still standing, but it was no longer a prison, no longer a source of fear. It was just a house again, empty, lifeless, like the many other houses in the neighborhood. And that was how it would stay. The ritual had worked. The spirit of Lily had been banished, the portal closed, and the house was finally free from the evil that had haunted it. But Sarah knew that it wasn't just the house that had been changed. She and James had been changed, too. They had both seen the depths of darkness. Both had come face to face with their greatest fears, and they had survived. That bond would never be broken. "I'm glad we're leaving," James said, his voice quiet but filled with relief. Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving the house as they got into their car. "Me too," she said, taking his hand. "I don't think I could ever live there again. But it's over now. It's behind us." They didn't speak much as they drove away, the silence between them comfortable, as if they had finally found peace after all the chaos. The world outside the car seemed so normal, so untouched by the horrors they had faced. It almost felt surreal. But Sarah knew better. She knew that the terror they had experienced wasn't just something that happened in the dark corners of haunted houses. It was something that could happen anywhere, at any time. It was a reminder that evil could lurk in the most unexpected places, waiting to seep into their lives. It had started with the doll, with that simple object that seemed harmless at first, a gift from the past. But it had opened a door to something far darker, far more powerful than they could have ever imagined. And for a while, they had been trapped in it, just like Margaret and her family before them. But they had broken free. They had beaten it. As the car passed the final turn, Sarah's thoughts drifted to the future. They would rebuild their lives away from the horrors of the past. They had each other, and that was all that mattered now. The house, the doll, and the darkness that had haunted them were gone. They didn't need to talk about it anymore. It was over. They would start fresh. After all, the past could not be changed. It had happened. But their future was still unwritten. And that was where they would focus their energy. They had earned a new beginning. As the car drove away from the house, Sarah could feel the weight of her past slipping away with each mile. The doll, the spirit, the house, they were all part of a chapter she would never read again. She glanced at James, who was looking ahead at the road, his eyes distant but calm. He had been her strength through all of it, and now, as they left the house behind, she realized how much he had sacrificed for her. She couldn't have saved him without his love, without his belief in her. And that, more than anything else, was what would keep them strong. "Where do we go from here?" she asked quietly. James turned to her, his expression softening as he reached over to squeeze her hand. "We go forward," he said, his voice steady. "We go wherever we want." And as they drove into the fading light of the evening, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. The kind of hope that comes with knowing you've made it through something terrible and emerged stronger on the other side. They had faced the darkness and they had won. Now they would live,